Thank you very much. Good morning. My name actually is Adam Rafinski. I don't know why it turned out that I'm the only one that gets addressed with his last name as being the first name, but nevertheless. Before I begin, I would like to say that I'm very thankful for the opportunity to speak in this conference today. I feel very honored and excited about the opportunity to share my thoughts and with so many top-class researchers and scholars here, since I'm convinced that one has to take risks in order to open up fresh perspectives on forms of expression such as digital games that, in my opinion, did not yet find their own definitive language. I hope that my speculative approach on the nature of subjectivity in the experience of digital gameplay might offer some interesting ideas that which I'm very much looking forward to discuss with you. I strongly believe that the experience of digital gameplay re-emphasizes the paradox of identification for a generation without an existential conflict. First-person games are paradigmatic for this issue, since consciousness is addressed here directly in the representational setting. In the next 20 minutes, I will provide a speculative analysis of the No Russian level of a military ego shooter Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 by Infinity Ward from 2009. Therefore, I will approach the connection between the very paradox of the identification process with the ontology of digital games on three levels. First, I will examine the doubling of consciousness described by Roger Caillois's metaphor of a mask. Then I will outline the speculative function of violence in the very dialectic process in providing self-consciousness within the media of computer games. And finally, I will detail the close interrelation between action and reflection, which I will refer to as performative reflection as the main point of my paper. Performative reflection suggests, in my opinion, a rephrase of René Descartes' cogito argument for a generation of gamers. By taking the paradox in the German word Spiel into account, which means game and play at the same time, the same like in French, and the usage of a word in a sentence defined whether you're describing artificial competition framed within a set of rules, a game, or the movement of improvisation within the let's act as if or this is a game subtext, a play. By taking this very paradox into account, it is hard to imagine that this concept could actually provide a notion of freedom and productiveness in terms of subjectivity beyond its aesthetic dimension. So the question is, how can improvisation within a system of fixed rules occur? The answer lies within the performative act oscillating between game and play. Therefore, I'm using the term gameplay all the time to translate this paradox in English. Therefore, gameplay is always grounded in an existential notion of a present. Games cannot hold any message without being performed, which means not only interpreted, but really enacted. Both game and play, although on different ontological bases, are determining each other and allow access to the paradox ontology of gameplay. Gregory Bateson showed in his play theory how the meta-communicative message, "this is a game," constantly produces paradoxes as soon as spoken out. Namely, and I quote Bateson here, "these actions in which we now engage do not denote what those actions for which they stand would denote," end quote. It follows that the challenge is to gather the ability for conscious differentiation, since the reference to the not game is constantly present and communicated within the rule-based reality. Hence, the paradox of games thrives from the impossibility of identification between subject and object. Due to this paradox, the process of identification has to take a detour over a circular in order to become verified. If the first term is true, all the other become false, and the other way around. Rules cannot be determined without holding the premise in themselves to be broken. Therefore, the simple act of setting up a rule is already a way of breaking the rule, and the term gameplay is sent into its own aporia. Computer games hold also this instability of the "this is a game" message in themselves that Bateson identified. Here, one communicates constantly about things that do not exist. Games with relation to reality of a first order, for example, the game tag, are sometimes destroyed by accident because of discrepancies between the real and the imaginative. This can have huge consequences on reality itself. Therefore, Bateson also speaks about the map territory differentiation, which you're all probably very familiar with. In the case of computer games, however, I would suppose that this instability is only of aesthetic interest, since the virtual is capable of a second-order logic, which allows for alienation of the subject from its imagination. In the playful diffusion with objects, the presence of the artificial rule-based world becomes absolute. Here, the indistinguishability between reality and fiction becomes lucid, meaning not any longer differentiable, since evaluated onto a new term. In terms of subjectivity, the computer game thus becomes not only a further differentiated form of classical understanding of gameplay, but a logical, higher developed mechanism that allows for the coexistence of paradox ontologies and for implementing multiple, sometimes even contradicting, rules into the reality we are about to share. A phenomenon I wish to capture in my paper with the term high algorithmic resolution as a core characteristic of digital games. It aims to describe the ontological fineness of the inter-reflexive dualism between subject and object in the process. Having said this, I will now begin with my analysis. It is not surprising that first-person games play a paradigmatic role when it comes to analyzing digital games philosophically. They are not only offering a correct simulation of a space in a total state of emergency, but they are also touching upon the philosophical experience of self-consciousness in the symbolic connotation. Now, Russian, the third level of a military ego shooter, Modern Warfare 2, contains one of the most controversial and discussed scenes in video game history. I think it perfectly demonstrates how the dialectic of subjectivity unfolds itself in digital games. Here, the paradox of identification is not only present in the gameplay, but also in the subject of a sequence. This unique doubling allows for insights into how self-consciousness operates in this medium. I assume that you are familiar with the scene, but please allow me to remind you by having it run in the background. Okay, here we go. In this provoking, but as I think, thoughtfully composed stage, the player participates in a massacre by taking on the role of an American undercover agent that undermines Russian terrorists. The massacre becomes ground zero for a global military conflict that sets the tone. Can we have tone also running? Yeah, thank you. That sets the tone for the entire game. The player participates in this massacre and has basically three options. First, he can act as if in order to keep his cover in the game and participate in shooting helpless civilians. Second, he can choose not to shoot at all and simply follow the lead of other terrorists. Or third, he can shoot at the terrorists themselves. But if one shoots at the terrorists, the player loses his cover and the game is stating that he did not play his role correctly and the game is over. In the censored version of the game, like the German one, in Germany we have one of the hardest censorships in the world, shooting at civilians is also prohibited by the game, but in the uncut version it is the most reasonable way to act due to the game structure and narration. I'm tempted to refer to Roger Caillois, who used the mask as a metaphor for consciousness in his play theory, in order to describe the knowledge a player must acquire to withstand the very paradox in becoming somebody else. The mask carrier must know that he is both at the same time, the actor controlling the mask and the very manifestation of the mask itself. Caillois stretches on the point that in mimicry, knowledge and the usage of this knowledge are closely intertwined. They are not because the mask carrier is conscious about the meaning of a mask, but because the relation defines the very paradox of the game played. When a ghost is acknowledged in the mask, so the play of a mask carrier succeeds. The illusion is perfect, and the others watching him wearing the mask and playing with it are fearing the mask. The mask carrier, on the other hand, has to withstand the balance between the knowledge of a mask, meaning its artificiality, and its function within the game, meaning its potential to overcome the profane's fear. Otherwise, he would fall into madness, which means to understand the illusion he created as reality, and thus to lose himself in the role. In digital games, there is a slight but crucial twist concerning this identity struggle. The doubling of consciousness itself is embedded within the procedural rhetoric of computer games, which you all know from greatly described by Ian Bogus. In other words, the event of self-awareness is extracted from the player and transferred into the unfolding of the code itself. One should not underestimate this mental achievement in playing out the very irrationalism of such a cruelty, like in the mask behind me. Such a playful access to the doubling of consciousness refers to the autonomy of thinking, as I believe. The sovereign act within the identification process, which drives the whole process, is the experience of the impossible, if you like, a meditation about the extremes of the possible. In fact, we are confronted here with the inner experience of the subject, whose conflict is exposed in the unfolding of gameplay. The inner substance of the subject, meaning his unity, is lost. Here, the inner and sovereign experience of the subject becomes the very experience of the impossible unity and the crack of the self. This crack is the very reason for the metaphorical usage of mere violence, in which negation shows itself, keeping the dialectical process running. Due to its strong link to interactivity and context extension, it is clear that violence appears as one of the most significant themes of the medium. In the case of No Russian, the act of murder becomes alienated from agency, only to reoccur in the synthesis of creating reason out of the unreasonable. The game seduces the player by offering a surrealistic fantasy. It allows the experience of the ultimate existential and simplest surrealistic act, as described by André Breton in his second manifesto of surrealism from 1930. It means to shoot blindly and randomly at a perfect day into the crowd. In the abyss of the unreasonable act of pure negation, the very act of violence forces the player to identification. In this sense, one can argue that while games in general make believe in absurd action, digital games tend to make believe in absurd identifications. Therefore, I wish to claim that violence in digital games has to be understood as an outcry for existence. What calls for existence here is not the subject, but the dialectical movement of self-consciousness we nowadays call playing. Please allow me to make my point a little clearer by referring to the famous chapter Master and Slave of Phenomenology of Spirit by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, which, as you might be familiar with, in the 1930s was declared anthropologically to the key sequence in achieving self-consciousness by Alexander Kuzhaev. For Kuzhaev and Hegel, the dialectic of master and slave is not about the elimination of the other, but about ruling over him. According to Hegel, self-consciousness can only appear since the reality between master and slave is set as an absolute in the process. Therefore, we cannot find in the formal logical reality of computer games any kind of true death or end. Only its constant presence reminds us, or the player, that he is still taking part in the process. As soon as death would occur, the reality constructing process would simply end. In this sense, it is the same in Hegel, because the master can only be the one who does not fear death, or even better, who does not have a concept of it. The slave, on the other hand, fears for his own existence and would prefer to accept the sovereignty of his master in favor of losing his life. By the way, the same holds true for the dialectic between the one knowing the secret of a mask and the other fearing it. But without reflection, without sticking to the rules, every orgy, every act of radical squandering, of meaningless negation is worthless. In his essay, The Dionysian Worldview from 1870, which is the first text in which the concept of Dionysian artistry in Nietzsche appears, Friedrich Nietzsche makes clear that the servant of Dionysus always has to observe himself while losing control. And I quote Nietzsche here. Just as intoxication is the play of nature with man, so the creation of the Dionysian artist is play with intoxication. This state can only be understood symbolically unless one experienced it himself. It is similar to a situation in which one dreams and at the same time experiences the dream as a dream. The votary of Dionysus must be intoxicated and at the same time must catch himself in the act as his own spectator. Dionysian artistry does not show itself in the alternation of presence of mind and intoxication, but in their proximity, their coexistence. End quote. In the case of digital games, such behavior can be identified through the tension between action and reflection, both referred to as the ecstasy in gaming or the state of flow. In this very moment of gameplay experience, action and reflection tend to become closely interrelated, a phenomenon I wish to grasp with the term performative reflection. In the case of No Russian, this becomes evident at the very end of this orgy of meaningless creation, when the game reminds the player that he was absolutely powerless. After the player shoots randomly into the helpless crowd and lives through a fight with the police, as you just saw, at the very end of this level, which you just saw, I'm sorry to repeat this, the circle reveals itself. Suddenly, the player gets shot by the leading terrorist with whom he was collaborating the whole time. The player experiences his own virtual death, and the game is showing him that it knew all the time that he was indeed a double agent. The curtain is lifted. The radical act of improvisation turns out to be nothing more than a mere illusion. At this point, both action and reflection collide into a single lucid spot at which the process of self-reflection is replaceable with the very act of playing. Here the player is left alone to question his immediate self-reference, which was intentionally placed prior to his relationship with the game world. Digital games remind us about the possibility of breaking this fundamental difference. And gamers learn that within this very paradox, tension, subjective meaning arises beyond inescapable systems. In a speculative sense, the player is not only observing himself while playing the game, he is indeed creating subjective meaning by experiencing the evaluation of consciousness to self-consciousness in Hegelian terms. The game is speaking it out quite clearly. That is not a message, this is a message. These last words at the very end of No Russian should suggest that the subject's death is a reasonable sacrifice in order to keep the process of the gameplay running. In this very death, which the player experiences out of his own subjective perspective, the player gets suddenly reminded about the very absurdity of the activities he got himself involved in. The player accomplished his goal and failed at the same time. But his very sacrifice is opening up a narration to continue and thus keeping the process of gameplay alive. And as you're all familiar with, Modern Warfare 2 is by its nature of being a commercial game, like many games, about nothing more than selling a narration. Nevertheless, this thoughtfully composed stage is showing that in digital games, identity means to hold on to being. A firm identification finds itself, only in a sacred revelation which points upon something that is outside of the illusion, outside of the screen, and thus grounds the elusive experience of subjectivity into an existential notion of a present. Here the paradox of a doubling of consciousness falls apart, and one is left with the choices, becoming the mask or being the mask carrier. But instead of getting stuck on this point and to end the game, most players tend to continue their quest for the other. They return into the paradox with the knowledge they gathered. The sacrifice of the player remains present throughout the whole game, since the player is searching for the true drama, because as Georges Bataille expresses himself so wonderfully, and I quote, "One reaches the state of ecstasy or of rapture only by dramatizing existence in general," end quote. Without dramatization, one is incapable to go beyond oneself. And an intimate consciousness is provoked through which the merging of subject and object can evolve and an event occurs. According to Bataille, this very intimacy is how the sacred is showing itself as the nimbus of anguish, the very heart of drama. In digital dramas, the projected inner experience of the self-consciousness is also directed towards intimacy. Here war becomes the illusion of the unleashed violence to the outside, and thus No Russian can be understood as the sacred moment in Modern Warfare 2, where anguish reveals itself as the seed for narration. But not only that, through performative reflection, the question of the unquestionable, of the absolute certain, purely present in readdressing, is readdressed in the urge questioning the is in the process of game playing. The graspable presence of thought in the mirror of excessive negation is reminding the subject once again of this existential verifiable knowledge. I would like to conclude by trying to repose briefly René Descartes' question of the absolute certain expressions of ontological truth for a generation of gamers. Is it really possible to deduce a similar self-reflexive circular argument like the infamous cognitive argument for the experience of digital games? For traditional type of games like the game of tag, this is easy to prove. The childish game dictates the ontological value already in its very language. It is always the one who is. In the presence of it is, we find the very manifestation of a fundamental knowledge Descartes gathered, because the paradox becomes absolute for the time gameplay is at hand. However, reflection in traditional games is not emphasized since it is lacking the necessary distance from reality. In digital games, however, as I have discussed, the paradox of identification is doubled. In contrary to traditional games, the player is thus in a state of a permanent oscillating dichotomy between the inner and outer dimension of existential experience. Already through the bodily movement, and maybe even be so minimal, the player is constantly reminded of a physical necessity, the murmur of being. The premise of the subject and the object polarity is therefore ontologically placed. This dynamic relation of both polarities gives the dead material life and allows for performative reflection to occur. Descartes spoke about a constantly differentiating consciousness, which is unable to put the very process of reflection into question. For him, this very process of reflection means the whole presence of his existence. At the very core of performative reflection, we find a similar limit to the reflection process, which is revealing the ontological facticity of our subjective existence. It reveals itself in the question who plays and who is being played. Is it me who is playing, meaning the one who is it in the language of tech, or is it the other, meaning the machine, which plays with me, and which is actually it? We are dealing with the question of the objective displacement of experience subjectivity, which we encounter in digital games in a performative way. Personally, I feel strongly that in the darkness of performative reflection, this question becomes lucid and leaves the human with nothing more than the knowledge of his own presence. The incarnation of the very act of reflection becomes the principle of deduction of all possible events in the algorithmic medium. Both thinking and acting are bound by play. A sensibility for it is graspable through the experience of gameplay. It offers a contemporary access to the certainty of the event, which one should not underestimate. Therefore, I strongly suggest re-emphasizing René Descartes' famous reality engine I play, therefore I am. Performative, I'm sorry, nearly done. Just 3 more sentences. Performative reflection allows to dance with the code in the state of lucid trance. If one begins to philosophize through the experience of digital games, one finds himself in the same situation like the old Greeks, which were also used to discuss philosophical and mathematical problems while walking. Well, I think it's much easier to solve problems when you're being moved by them. In this case, philosophy becomes truly a creative process of action, and thus is brought closer once again to everyday life. I just wanted to show that computer games can be a perfect reminder of this type of problem solving. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Again?
Nobody else.
So again?
So, you said several times things like the player reflects, the player's reminded of, makes a decision, and so on. And you're talking about one of the scenes in a game which has been most discussed, you say. Did you see this in the discussions, that people were supporting your statements, or are these based on logical reasoning only?
In a way, you always find this argument in controversial games that try to cross boundaries. And in a way, I think it's also in the interest of the industry to do this, why they are also pushing so much money into serious games, etc. You find it underneath a little bit when players are or reviewers are stating that it's actually just a game, and that there's also a moral message within this scene, since it's framed with this revealance in the end. But in the way how I encountered it, not. That's why I had the urge of doing it, to be honest. Maybe just a little reminder on this issue in general. I'm working in Karlsruhe for the University of Arts and Design, and I'm co-founder of the Game Lab there. And we became big in the news in Germany, and I think it was also around internationally, with a game called 1378 Kilometers by a student of mine, Jens Stober, and student and colleague of mine, Jens Stober, which is basically, it's a mod of Half-Life 2, and it's a simulation of the inner German border situation from 1963, I think, where you can play as refugees or guardians, which was creating a huge outcry because, of course, people were asking, can you do this with a game? On the first side, and on the other side, can you deal with history also in this way by making a game out of it? And yeah, that's why I had personally a connection to this topic this way. So I just wanted to clarify it in a philosophical language.
Yeah, I just moved. I just wanted to ask you, would you go with me if I suggested you be a little less polemic and say, I also play, therefore I am?
I also play, therefore I am?
Yeah.
Why would you place the also if I...
Well, rather than saying that because I play, I am. Okay, that you can say, but it's not the whole story, because you do other things as well as playing. But no, I wanted to ask you something, because okay. I was talking to Greg Curry last night in the bar, actually, and we were talking about violence in games, and I always tend to say, that it's very, very difficult to draw linear connections between violence in games and violence in real life. But I assume that one we saw, I've never seen it before, but I assume it's probably one which has a fairly high age limit for the users. What do you think about the whole idea of shielding children from violent games in relation to their presumed maturity at a certain age? It's quite a difficult question.
No, I mean, it's an important question, of course, because, I mean, we have to protect our children from representations or sexual or whatever content when we're not that mature, that they can make this conscious differentiation. I actually would even go so far to say, I mean, this example, it was very drastically represented. But I understand violence in this sense more like in an abstract sense, which comes through like the necessity of acting with the algorithmic world, keeping the process running, as I said a couple of times. There are many forms, for example, of indirect violence, which are, like, for example, occurring even like in play games like SimCity, where your actions have like consequences which are barely represented in the game, but are also in a way present to the player. So there are many concepts of violence which you can play with, and I think you can also, as a game designer, explore, do a lot of innovative, subversive work there with this concept.
Last question?
Okay, thank you. This is a fascinating sequence, of course. I just want to question you on, well, the utility of taking it as prototypical or paradigmatic of the question of violence in video games, because it is justifiably sort of discussed because it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I also want to press you a little bit on the significance of this being in a Russian airport and not really that painful to what I presume is a prototypical implied gamer here, namely an American adolescent. I think there's a reason for that, and I think also that it's a little, problematic to a certain extent that the real message is being delivered when the American player avatar is being killed. But maybe that's just me. I'm just wondering whether you find those interesting questions in this.
I totally agree with you. But I don't know, have you played, for example, the third part of a game? Or have you read about it? It was just
No, I haven't killed the Eiffel Tower yet, but I played the first one where there is a similar suicide mission.
Because it's interesting because this was also brought up in the discussion, of course. Yeah. I mean, in Russia, when you buy this game, the whole level is just removed.
Yeah.
Just
and I think there's a reason why that.
Yeah, of course, totally. Maybe I can just quickly say something to this and then come back to your first question. When you have a look on the third part, for example, they tried in a way. Well, first of all, Activision, who's publishing the game in the US and many countries in the Western world, and was owning Infinity Ward, the studio who makes the game, they kicked out the main game designers from the first two parts. Because also of controversial and how they inner politics, and they reacted actually to this political issue in the first game by giving like Russia more, or the Russian people more a bigger role also in the game. Like they introduced also Russian characters who are saving American presidents and whatever. Yeah, and to come back on your first question, I'm aware of it, that it's constructed in a way, that I'm like in a way just like projecting these ideas on this scene. But I also have to say that for me, because I'm also working as an artist and a curator, for me this is like a very creative way of like accessing, and getting into the process of like meditating and thinking about issues. And if I may say something very personal, I came to digital games back after playing my childhood with them by getting reminded that I had my first aesthetic experience through playing them. That digital games were capable, for me personally, to provide me with something that music. I mean, I grew up in a family of musicians. That music was not able to do, that theater was not able to do, that movies were not able to do. And I was thinking about that, and I just wanted to give something back. And I feel sometimes that, it's totally legit, even like in a context like here, which is thankfully not that formal, but still, has the Anspruch, the dedication, or the wants to make a serious statement in philosophy to take on risks in, just throwing something in. I'm young, and I think I can still do this.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.